Okay, so I've recorded 3 videos so far. This is the 4th one for today, Sunday, April 14, 2024. And as I said before, I'll be releasing each one every few days to provide regular content, but also every few days because it gives people a chance to kind of catch up. So what I did, the first one I did today was part 4, which was just, there was just one episode of part 4. It's entitled, each title is this, so I have a main title, which is the same for all the videos, and then the subtitle tells you the topic that we're currently on, and the subtitle for that one is Genetic Engineering in Genesis, and then I had a two-part 5th episode that was entitled Sons of God and the Nephilim, and now this is part 1 of part 1 of episode 6 on the angels. And as you can imagine, Mauro Bellino, what he's trying to show here is that, all this theological baggage, all this theological content has been superimposed on the scriptures late in the game when the Old Testament was compiled, during and after the Babylonian captivity, basically. And that in reality, the terms angelos in Greek and malachim in Hebrew only give us the sense of messenger. It doesn't tell us anything about the nature of these beings or their essence. It only tells us about their function or vocation as messengers. And you would think that that in all of these early texts in the Old Testament, it would be explaining what they were. It would be giving us a detailed theological explanation of who these angels were, but apparently there was no need for the authors to tell us because it was already known. There was no debate. And what this leads Mauro Bellino to conclude is that these beings were like us. They were flesh and blood, concrete beings who engaged in the same activities and did many of the same things. And so that's what I'm going to start off on here. I'm going to skip ahead to where he really gets into it. So these figures, he says, are already present at the beginning of human life and make their appearance as guardians in Eden after the expulsion of the first humans. We see that in Genesis 3:24. They're present again as Elohim messengers in many events of the history of the people of Israel. They are involved in helping Hagar, Abraham's servant, in Genesis 16:9. They introduce themselves to Abraham in Genesis 18:2, and his nephew Lot in Genesis 19:1, and then an angel precedes the people of Israel during the pilgrimage in the desert, Exodus 23:23. He says we don't want to make a compendium of angelology as it has developed over the centuries. Since there's already vast literature on it, we only want to provide the reader with some basic concepts useful to understand the differences between the real literal text and the massive conceptual hoarding that religion has superimposed upon it. He says some important things here, so I'm going to continue reading. The manipulation, so he's going to start kind of summarizing what I said at the very beginning. The manipulation began in the so-called post-exile or post-exilic period, that is, after the Jewish people were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar II in the early 6th century BCE, and the subsequent permanence in the territory of Babylon with the resulting cultural contaminations. We have already said that the names in Greek and Hebrew, angelos and malach, define the function and not the essence of these figures, and this, in our view, has a very simple and straightforward explanation. The authors of the text did not feel the need to analyze their nature because it was blatant and obvious to all. These were similar humans and thus did not require any sort of speculation. He says that the conception of a spiritual world divided into various hierarchies reveals the influence of Mesopotamia and Persia. Once in contact with these beliefs, Jewish thought develops its doctrine, using a symbolism that was alien to its original culture, used to systematize its own representation of the angelic world. I'm tempted to stop and say something about that, because I don't believe that's the end of the story. I do believe that the ancient peoples made a mistake in deifying these flesh and blood beings from off planet. But I also believe that there are higher entities that are attached to these same planets, but in a higher dimension. They're basically considered celestial deities, celestial gods. They are both feminine and masculine, or male and female, gods and goddesses. But I also believe that when a people on a given planet are immature, when they're young in their history, and they come into contact with beings who are so much more advanced, they appear to them as gods, and it becomes easy to look up to them as deities and to be manipulated and to worship them as such. And then you can imagine how religious cults rise up as a result, and that they extend into time beyond the lifetime of the beings that they're worshiping. So that's what I think happened. That's largely what early paganism did. I like a lot of aspects of paganism, but I'm not into the pure polytheism, simply because. Now, I'm not against polytheism, like I said, because Dharma says that there are many deities, and I believe that there are higher entities, celestial beings. But of course, they're subordinate to the one, to the all-pervasive God of the universe, of the cosmos. So there's a lot that I like about paganism, but its early history really leaves much to be desired, because they were worshiping beings that were flesh and blood beings, and some of them were helpful, but some of them were very unhelpful. Probably most of them were given to a lot of what we would call of the vices, or passions, in a very uncontrollable manner, and wielded their power in a very self-aggrandizing manner. But anyway, let's go on with the chapter. So he wants to show that these beings are not the beings of later Christian theology, but rather, they're not these sort of semi-incorporeal or etheric or phantasmagoric, or whatever there's other words we could use to describe it, entities, immortal entities, but rather flesh and blood. They're not, they're flesh and blood. They're described, and he wants to show throughout this chapter that they're described in these very normal flesh and blood way. So he talks about how later theology, they categorize these beings into the 9 choirs of angels, cherubim, seraphim, thrones, virtues, powers, dominions, principalities, angels and archangels. But he says this doesn't really match up with what we know about Elohim's messengers described in the Old Testament. So he's going to start with Zechariah and the Malachim. He says, in our exemplification of how angels are truly represented in the Old Testament, we now quote a very curious, brief excerpt from the book of the prophet Zechariah, which we will later examine more extensively in order to observe some absolutely interesting, quote-unquote, visions, which are rarely, indeed almost never, surveyed. So he starts with the first chapter of Zechariah. He says that a first curiosity is found in chapter 1, verse 10. This character is described as a man, specifically as a man, therefore an individual of flesh and bones. But in the following verse, when the other men talk to him, he is referred to as an angel. So he gives the literal translation as, "And they answered to the angel of Yahweh, the one standing in between the myrtles." Then in chapter 2 of Zechariah, verse 7, he reproduces that verse with the English translation. "And here is the angel speaking. Here is the angel speaking with me is coming out, and another angel is coming out to meet him." And Bellino says, "The second messenger orders the former to give the young prophet information concerning Jerusalem. But the way he invites him to do so is definitely not that quote-unquote spiritual. Indeed, the order is, run, talk to the young man." In this brief passage, we notice once again the obvious need for the narrator to give a precise description of place and situation. A deep valley, a field of myrtle, this Malak standing among the bushes, from where he later comes out in a second Malak that does the same to meet the former and invites him to, quote, run and talk to the young man. So unavoidable questions arise. If it was not a description of a real scene, if it was more or less a vision, some spiritual or ethereal vision, why did the narrator repeatedly stress the fact that the Malak was amidst or in between or within the bushes of myrtle? Why did he have to make the two Malachims move to allow them to talk to him? In a very human manner. Why on earth should a spirit tell another to, quote, run to talk to someone? And why would the text, and this is just me asking, I want to put this in very general terms. I think this is the best way to summarize those three questions. If these beings were, as Christian theology portrays them, why is the text doing the opposite of what we would expect? We would expect the text to emphasize supernatural aspects of their behavior, but instead it's actually laying emphasis on some very normal activity, very human, very flesh and blood, very concrete activity. So then we come to the text with Abraham, the Lord, and the Malachim in chapter 18 of Genesis. This is the famous scene where you get the famous icon in the Orthodox Church where the two angels meet Abraham, or the three angels meet Abraham under the tree of Mamre, which becomes the basis for an early Trinitarian theology. It's said to be a foreshadowing of the New Testament, of the Trinity, or not a foreshadowing, but kind of an I don't know if allegory is the right term of the Trinity. Abraham is located near the Oaks of Mamre, a southern Palestine village along the road linking the north of the country with Hebron. The patriarch is sitting underneath the shade of the tent because it is the hottest hour of the day. 18:2, here's the translation he gives of the Hebrew into English. "And here are three men standing before his place. He saw them and ran to meet them at the entrance of the tent. We therefore have a flushed Abraham who, while resting under the shadow of his dwelling, sees three people in front of him and runs to meet them." Then a very detailed description follows. He bows before them to the ground, calling them my Lord, Adonai. He invites them to stop over. He tells them that he will bring some water to wash their feet. He invites them to lie down in the shade of the trees. So clearly these quote-unquote divine messengers must have seemed pretty dirty, dusty, and hot, he says. They must have had indeed the aspect of individuals of flesh and blood who are walking in an almost desert area during the hottest hours of the day. In 18:5 it says, "You will do so as you said." A complete expression saying in substance, all right, go ahead. Thus, oddly, these spirits appreciated the chance to freshen up their feet and eat before continuing their journey. They were in fact aimed towards Sodom. At some point, the group splits up. The supposed leader stops to talk with Abraham, while the others continue, Genesis 18:22, to the next destination. So after receiving the approval, Abraham orders the servant to prepare much more than what he had hastily offered. He tells him to prepare fresh bread, cook a calf, to be eaten with a drink of sour milk and fresh milk, and lays it all before them. Definitely a very long break, despite the preparation time. A stop is necessary to restore tired and hungry bodies. Text says, and they ate, in verse 8 of chapter 18. The scene, he says, recalls Middle Eastern typical nomadism. When an important guest arrives, that guest is offered all comforts and conveniences and consumes the meal in tranquility as his prominent position requires. So now we come to the angels in Sodom in the next chapter of Genesis, chapter 19. So two of those angels from the previous chapter who continued on their journey went forward to Sodom. This is while and in the meantime, the leader of the group, Adon, the Lord, stops to talk with Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah. So the first verse of chapter 19 reads, in the night, two angels arrived in Sodom. So it's high noon, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, is sitting near the city gate where the two stop. He recognizes them as belonging to the rank of Malachims, runs to meet them and bows down at their feet. The one who sees them runs to meet them as a sign of honor and respect. This has nothing to do with the tradition of the sudden and overwhelming apparitions. We are in the presence of a normal process of approaching two people walking quietly in a late and warm Middle Eastern afternoon. 19 verse 2 says, we will spend the night in the square or open place. So then Lot insists that they join him and enter his house. He bakes unleavened bread and they eat it, verse 3, which is quite strange behavior for spiritual beings who have discussions. They consume the evening meal. They had already eaten lunch with Abraham, and then consider several opportunities and finally decide where to spend the night. As the story continues, they bed down for the night. And then a frenzied crowd encircles Lot's home and calls for the guests, demanding that Lot hand them over in order to abuse them. How can you abuse pure spirits? Lot refuses and in return offers his virgin daughters instead. People of Sodom don't listen. They don't listen to reason. They try to break down the door to get a hold of the angels. The unfortunate Malachim realizes the risky situation, so they take Lot and drag him into the house and get rid of the attackers, with a very strange action in verse 11. They were struck, it says, the crowd that was trying to get to the angels were struck with sudden blindness. So what this is indicating is that the Malachim had a special technology that allowed them to blind their assailants. We're not talking about some kind of supernatural activity on the part of angels as understood in Christian theology. So the two Malachims dazzle the people in the crowd, who are then unable to see and are forced to give up trying to break through the door. The two then urge Lot to take his family away from the city, stating that they are about to destroy Sodom. The two messengers of the Lord, who we remember stopped at Abraham's to explain to him the reasons why they had decided to destroy the city, knowing that time is running out, Genesis 18:22-32, tell Lot the decision has been taken and must be accomplished with no more delay. Then follow the events everyone knows about. They flee, the destruction of the cities occur with burning sulfur from Yahweh out of the heavens, 19 verse 24, and Lot's wife becomes a pillar of salt. So in summary, the angels, they're walking, they're getting tired, they're needing rest, they're getting dusty and dirty. They're happy to wash themselves. They eat twice in one day. They have lunch with Abraham, dinner with Lot, decide where to spend the night, and defend against an aggression by using apparently technological means. So these are, he concludes, Anunnaki Elohim, who are messengers. So they're of a lower ranking of Elohim. The next scene is from Tobit. I'm actually going to stop here. I'm going to divide this into probably 2 parts. So let's stop here. Could be a third, but I think it'll be 2. But you never know. Let's stop here and pick up with the next video.